Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This week, we're going to be covering a very fascinating and challenging set of topics. Some of the most difficult and also important set of topics that social psychologists felt obligated to study. This week, we'll be looking at concepts like prejudice, fascism, obedience, groupthink, and this idea of the authoritarian personality. This was a concept for, a type of person who was shaped by a world, by a society that mismanaged suffering and savagery and mismanaged the role of the individual in society, leading to a generally prejudiced personality. So not exactly someone who was prejudiced against a type of religion or a race, or prejudiced against different ideas or different political identities, but something in common that prejudiced individuals might share. As we alluded to in an earlier lecture, social psychology really took off after World War II, and the sense that World War II had challenged human concepts of decency, of innate moral character, aspects of humanity that were challenged by World War I, certainly. Maybe at one point in European history there was a fantasy that even if different nations were on different sides, they all had a certain level of honor that would prevent the very worst excesses of what we saw in the 20th century. Such as chemical warfare, the use of mechanized firearms and trench warfare, of course, the use of the atom bomb in World War II, and last but not least, the Holocaust. There was a great need to try to understand these phenomena, which were taken as being threats to human progress. As bloody as the 19th century may have been for European nations and their colonial projects, there was still a very strong utopian sentiment, a hope that through modernity, by putting away some of the irrational and, as people would say today, tribal notions of the human species, that we could live more sensibly with each other and in nature. There was quite a shock when World War I and World War II turned out to be as truly horrific as they were. So in a way we could say that there was a naivete in the European consciousness that was going to have to be answered for, that was going to have to come back to roost, so to speak. A general theme for what we'll be looking at today is that the better human qualities, such as empathy, such as taking the perspective of someone else, such as ethics or morality or honor or decency, that a lot of these phenomena can be sidestepped, they can be canceled out, or they can be made irrelevant. That certain situations can happen where human beings don't really think about what's happening, they don't really have feelings about what's happening, and so the human element is sort of pushed to the side, so the truly more sinister facets of human life can just flow right by unimpeded. And so to begin, we're going to take a look at the Milgram study, which you can see on page 295. We're looking at chapter 5 this week. Milgram's study actually took place in 1955. And so we're talking about, the Cold War and, of course, post-World War II life, where it was not taken for granted that these things could not happen again. And yet, it was very hard for a lot of Western intellectuals to understand just how something so awful had happened with the knowledge of so many. So Milgram's study, and we have a video to it. It might be a good time to watch this video now. You could pause it now, or you could listen to my explanation of the Milgram study first, if you'd like. But the Milgram study asked, what would people do if they were simply told to do it? We have another question that this study asks, which is, what will people do if an authority tells them to do it? And so what we saw in the Milgram study, just to really boil it down, is that 2 out of 3 participants obeyed an order to deliver what they believed to be a lethal electric shock of 450 volts, while a researcher in a white lab coat gave them an order to do so. This would be a great time to check out the Milgram documentary that I am posting. Continuing, we can see on slide number 3, we have an interesting statistical chart which shows, just what we had said, that 63% of Milgram's participants, and these were only men aged 20 to 50, certainly an important confound. 20 to, men 20 to 50, 63% of them went all the way. But, it's a little more disturbing than that actually if we look at the chart, we can see that 80% of these participants were willing to give a strong shock of 135 to 180 volts, and so that is certainly significant pain. As we could see in the video, there were signs of distress and pain and fear from the learner in the other room. Now, of course, this did not really happen. They were not really shocking someone. But, and actually they used a recording so that the cries of help were always the same. And so that element was held constant. A key facet here is that there was an authority figure right in the room telling the teacher, as they believed that they were conveying a set of questions, words that had to be remembered, and then you basically give them back a multiple choice format, and the so-called learner has to guess, not guess. They're supposed to answer correctly which words were on the list and which weren't, and the participant, who just was the one administering the shock, was told, this is what we have to do. We're studying learning, and basically the presence of the Yale researcher in the room was found to significantly impact how likely the individuals were to actually do the shock as it continued, and as the Confederate, that means someone who's in on the experiment, learner in the other room continued to be in pain. The participant just kind of continued, and you could see that they were upset, and that they were being conditioned by something very painful to them. And basically what we see here is people doing something awful because someone they think is smarter than them or more qualified than them is saying, nah, it's not on you, please continue. This was a very key detail that they found in the Stanford prison study, which is a really interesting study that we certainly will talk about. Conditions for something evil to happen include, anonymity, where somehow something's able to separate you as a person from the victim as a person, and also the imperative or the rule, we could say, or the statement that this wasn't your fault. That when people are told this isn't your fault, they can kind of use that as fuel, maybe to do something truly bad. Regarding this researcher from Yale University who was in the room, we did find that obedience actually dropped 20.5% if the researcher gave directions from outside of the room. And now obedience dropped, much more. It dropped actually to only 40% total if the researcher, learner, and teacher were all in the same room. And so this is speaking to that element of anonymity that certainly helps something awful happening. But when you can actually see, let's say, the victim in the room, that for the most part, this is going to have a blood-curdling effect on the person who is being told to administer this acceptable form of violence. Other factors to think about, okay, especially when it comes to this concept of authority, is that obedience dropped to 47.5% when the whole experiment was conducted in a rundown building in Bridgeport, Connecticut, rather than at Yale University, which is, that's in New Haven, Connecticut. It's very close to Bridgeport. So what does this reveal to us about social power, about intellectual authority, about prestige or obedience? It seems that these phenomena tend to make people feel that violence is justified, among other things, but this is just simply one side effect of power, and the fear that comes from social stratification, and from, in a way, maybe the fear of being humiliated by, as it would appear, someone smarter than oneself. Now, participants who were allowed to bring a friend along into the study actually only obeyed at 15%. This is somewhat concerning. Or maybe somewhat encouraging, actually, depend how you look at it, that, it wasn't enough to, just be alone. And again, this is interesting because we might be saying, well, do people have morals at all? Like, what's going on here? But it seems that, the moral part of people, maybe gets switched off due to these certain conditions. But having a friend with you might switch those moral sentiments back on. This study by Milgram is often said to be highly unethical. The reason for this is because of the psychological distress that it inflicted on the participants. Participants were essentially led to believe that they killed someone, and furthermore, that they were capable personally of killing someone if told. Right? So 1955, these might be people who, maybe fought in World War II, or had parents or relatives who fought in World War I, who considered themselves, to be enemies of these dehumanizing movements that the United States fought against in the World Wars, and yet here they are being shown that in a different circumstance they might do just the same thing, or something, if not the same, very similar. I'm wondering what you all think of this, that I think this is a powerful study that shows some concerning things. Maybe this is important for a society to know, but on the other hand, is the experiment itself doing something that, causes harm, without, really taking the responsibility? Maybe something else to think about is why might this study be distressing to participants? Let's say they didn't have any relatives who had served. Nevertheless, why might it be distressing? An adjacent concept here that we need to talk about now is de-individuation. This is the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint in a group situation that fosters arousal and anonymity. Sports spectatoritis is, of course, a very nice slang term from this. If we can, especially think of the way, the phenomena of soccer hooligans, right? sort of these very, very hardcore soccer fans, or football, of course, as it's called in those nations, react and behave as a group, right? Specifically as a group, and how they act to the opposing team also as an out group. Um, why does this cause anonymity? That's something that we'll have to continue to talk about. But something about wearing masks is very important too. That wearing a mask actually creates a very different feeling, right? I'm wearing a mask. I know that everyone else can't see me. They just see, the body, and they see the face. And it's a different feeling to know that you're acting as a social entity, but you can't be identified personally. That somehow that tends to lift some weight of conscience, or, human moral obligation. That was one of the things that was very definitive in the Stanford prison experiment, right? Which basically showed that, some students were given silver aviators. They were made guards, and they were just told to watch over these other participants who were prisoners. And within a couple days, it just devolved into total abuse and mayhem. It's said that after Philip Zimbardo, the experimenter in the Stanford prison study, received a call from Stanley Milgram, who did the aforementioned study, and Milgram said, "Oh, congratulations! People are saying that you are the new perpetrator of the most unethical psychology study ever done." I guess one point I might want to highlight from that is that Zimbardo believed that part of what really accelerated the antisocial behavior in this prison experiment, and certainly something could be said about the lack of training, the lack of response to familiar stress situations, as we might see in SWAT teams, or more special forces teams, or individuals who are licensed mental health practitioners, to even take another facet on this, such as myself. We're sort of drilled endlessly about what to do with these high stress situations. But that's not always the case for a lot of individuals who have to, respond to extreme threats. And so what we might be looking at here, if we look at Milgram, and the way that this experimental effect was enhanced when the experimenter was outside the room, and enhanced when the researcher, the Yale dude, was inside the room, that sort of these normal-ish problems that people might have about basically fear, fear of someone else, fear of someone different, the lack of trust just that is endemic to the society, how these things seem to get ramped up or turned up by the loss of individual identity, whether that's something about being part of a group, as in the case of the soccer hooligans, or other phenomena where individuals have to wear, if not concealing sunglasses, then something like face masks, or thinking about something like the Klan, wearing full-on hooded masks to totally take away your uniqueness in that moment, and then in a way also taking away the moral obligation that people kind of feel intuitively as an individual. Right, so one thing about this isn't really saying that people aren't moral down to their core. It's kind of like saying that, well, what if these moral feelings that we have get switched off, or where it's just the physically tactile, and the tactile quality of that, the sensual quality of guilt, is turned off. What do people do? Can they navigate the situation intellectually, or are they totally at a loss when they don't have that gut feeling keeping them in check? It's very interesting. Folks who came of age in the 90s, or even the late 90s, early 2000s. I think I was my last year of high school in 99. Woodstock 99, which turned into a total disaster. And we have a video for that you can check out. It's believed that, of course, part of this was the biological factor, just, what was going on. It was way too hot. People were being price gouged on bottles of water, $4 a bottle of water back, 20 years ago. Long lines for the porta potties, not enough bathrooms, so there was sort of a general climate of pain and you could even say degeneracy if we wanted to really push it further. That was the kindling, and then the spark was the de-individuated nature of the crowd. How many people were at Woodstock '99? Thousands, tens of thousands, right? When there's such a mass, you can't really be spotted as an individual. It's kind of like, whoa, I can do whatever I want. Now's the time to really get something off my chest. Um, it's very common that we will hear, that emotions are more powerful than thoughts when it comes to influencing behavior. And, that doesn't mean that thought can't take charge, meaning a more, detached consideration of how things are. But, the sense that things feel to be a certain way is incredibly powerful. And, someone might need training to be able to overcome emotion in these moments. Not to paint too rosy a picture of these things that certainly do happen in highly trained systems. Might be a good time now to connect a few dots. Let's remember what Gordon Allport said about people of different racial groups, and how they actually can learn to like each other. They can learn to be less prejudiced if they can work together cooperatively. And, in all these things we're talking about here, that's not happening. There's no cooperation to sort of break down this, in a way we could call it primitive. We could call it intuitive, or emotional rather than intellectual, kind of fear, distrust of people different, people different from oneself. That working non-competitively with someone helps to take those pieces apart. It starts to clear the way for new ways of looking at each other. None of that stuff is going on here, and certainly in society it just isn't really the easiest thing to do if we want to work with people non-competitively, that aren't our coworkers. And hey, a lot of corporations or even schools do force their constituents to compete, so all the much more of a problem there to be considered. But in society, if you want to, work cooperatively with people different than you, that's probably going to have to be, if it's not part of a social club, it's going to have to be some volunteer work or something, right? It's going to have to be something that maybe is even on your dime. And so what if, right, due to, a poor social safety net, or, a poor economy in terms of what's available to, middle classes and impoverished classes, what if, you don't have any extra time to do these activities? Your life is just totally siloed into this job. There may not be space or time for that type of maturation process. A few more details now about prejudice, okay, having, raised this with the topic of Allport. Let's think of prejudice as a form of scapegoating, okay, or something that's a lot like scapegoating. This means that there is kind of a general level of aggression, frustration, or fear, in which hostilities are, kind of triggered by all these negative things. But then the aggression gets displaced. It gets put onto a safer target. Someone from a disadvantaged group who is, doesn't maybe have a platform to make their voice heard. They just are a group of people who get talked about. Safer targets, right, who maybe don't have money, power, or representation to push back or to prevent a counter spin. These are often the people, when things get really bad, who are just kind of blamed. And it's interesting with scapegoating. It can happen in all types of situations. There was this very publicized Will Smith and Jada Pinkett interview recently, where she, I actually haven't even seen it, but she, as I guess telling Will about, some other relationship that is kind of going to be the main thing for her. And there's a lot of, tension between the two of them. They can see, and, the moment I saw was when they were both just kind of agreeing that, oh, it's so crazy being an actor, being in Hollywood, and fair enough, but just, as I was watching that, it just seemed that all of this tension that they were bringing in was kind of just being like shuffled onto this topic of how tough it is to be an actor. And fair enough, okay, but it just gave the impression to me that they were kind of like bonding. They were kind of like jacking that topic up a little bit just to have something non-controversial to agree over. For people who used to watch, Married with Children, right, and where we had Al Bundy being part of this No Ma'am group with sort of these other husbands, unhappy husbands from the suburban, uh, domain that Al inhabited. That they were kind of coming together, not just as men, but of people who were frustrated by the women in their life. So, a group of guys shows up together, and maybe it's awkward, or maybe they like, right? Some of them have insecurities. It's like, what do we talk about? Does this person not like me? Then it can actually help things in a group like that. I'm not saying this is a good thing. This is just human psychology or human social psychology here. If they can all sort of put down some common enemy, it's like gives them a sense to see how these negative feelings there don't really belong to each other. They're not put on each other. They're not put on the self. But it just kind of can alleviate some of the tension to do some scapegoating. This might be fine if it wasn't so cancerous to society in general. So that's just a concrete way I would like to look at this. This isn't just a moral issue of, no, people shouldn't get together and be mean. Being mean is one thing, okay, and being mean might not be great, but this is a form of hype that actually people believe. That's the fascinating thing about scapegoating, is that it seems plausible. It actually starts to become plausible, and then it actually, we might even say that it's a form of psychosis. But there are other causes to prejudice that we could just see, media, having parents that have views towards particular groups, exposure or lack of exposure to, children or people of other races, or, maybe minimal encounters with individuals of the scapegoated group. And maybe even a few negative examples with people of the scapegoated group, and without the understanding to really look at these intergroup or interracial conflicts, people sometimes fall back on simplistic explanations that simplify. It's comfortable. Okay, let's go on. And now we're thinking of this idea of the prejudiced personality. So what sets the stage for this? A lack of education in a general level. The fact that education is, terribly expensive today, as everyone here knows, right? Lack of kind of non-competitive encounters with people of different groups. People might be segregated in terms of real estate, in terms of occupation, so there just really isn't even that normal human contact that people learn from. And then, of course, all these things like media that we talked about. And let's also not forget just the widespread existence of something like child abuse, where people are, kind of punished, but then later in life they might look back and say, oh, well, it wasn't really so bad. My parents had it bad, they had it worse, and all this stuff. And, that actually has the effect, among many other effects, it has the effect for this purpose here of downplaying the suffering that they personally experienced, and so then they can go on to downplay the suffering of others who go through, let's say, similar things. This phenomena of the authoritarian personality was studied by Theodor Adorno, a very cool theorist. He did this project with a number of other social psychologists and psychoanalysts in 1950. This was in his Authoritarian Personality Project. Our book tells us that people with high F-scale scores, this was the self-report measure that was developed to assess the authoritarian personality, F standing for fascism. High F-scale scorers are more likely to obey the experimenter's command to deliver a shock in Milgram-style experiments that were replicated. Adorno is very interesting in that he, was a Jewish individual who grew up in Germany, in what was known as the Weimar Republic. So a few notes. What is the Weimar Republic? So after Germany was putting itself back together after World War I, and kind of getting some help from other Western powers to put itself back together after World War I, we had an interesting divide where we had horrible social inequality, but we also had very brilliant, very progressive politician academic types. Okay, Adorno, actually would be in this mode. The influential sociologist Max Weber, who wrote the incredible study Protestantism and Capitalism, where he looked at how nations that remained largely in the Catholic faith did not industrialize as intensely as America or Britain, for example. So we kind of had these very powerful and smart academic kind of politician types, but there was a far right wing court system at that time. Also, many far right academics, but Adolf Hitler was actually arrested and tried for murder. Prior to him ever really making any big moves with the Third Reich, the Nazi Party. He actually was convicted of murdering a police officer in a protest, and they could have had him. Okay, but he made this plea from the stand, a personal statement saying explaining how even though he was Austrian, he saw himself as a German, and this was taken seriously by the judge, who not only did he not deport Adolf Hitler, not only did he not throw him away in jail for a long time. We're talking about a murder here, okay? Of a police officer. This was in some violent rally that happened. There was a lot of social unrest in Germany at that time, and I would even say far worse than what we experience today in terms of the level of social unrest in Germany. Having been a nation that horribly lost this war, and that was on top of other unstable social dynamics. But Hitler was essentially given a very light slap on the wrist sentence. Maybe he did. We could look this up if you want, but something like a year in prison, or maybe only 6 months. And this is when he wrote his, his manifesto. This far right wing judge kind of liked Hitler. Is the sense here, and basically let this dude go, and in a sense unleashed this man who destroyed his own country in terms of the consequences of that decision. This isn't to say that Germany didn't have a host of social or intellectual or economic problems at that time, but the kindling was there, but Adolf Hitler certainly came with the blowtorch. So this was the time that Adorno was coming up in. Okay, he did have to flee Germany. He came to America. Okay, like a lot of intellectuals, and this was when he did a lot of his work. Okay, and he ended up remaining in America and then going back to Germany maybe in the early '60s for the end of his life, where he did some of his really important works such as negative dialectics or aesthetic theory. Adorno says about the authoritarian personality. Okay. The authoritarian personality is not just someone who's insane. The authoritarian personality is not just someone who's irrational. Right? So, this is, I think, an unfortunate and very dangerous point of confusion about fascism, is that it's just as dumb, it's some dummy stuff, it's chauvinistic. It just is someone who refuses to pick up a book. It's much more insidious than that, where fascism actually receives a tremendous amount of life and invigoration and substance from sophisticated and despotic views of nature. Basically saying that it's one against nature, and if you don't kill, you're going to be killed, and really articulating these things in very clear and forceful ways. Not the least of which being that, people who are part of modern democracies, are raised to believe that they should have a clean conscience and that we're the good guys, other guys and the bad guys. And nevertheless, at many points, individuals who serve democratic countries are forced or are coerced or are rewarded for engaging in anti-democratic activities. And so we have something like a Freudian defense mechanism here. As these feelings happen very quickly, let's just say of shame, anger, fear, or revulsion for someone different than you. People very quickly will rationalize what's going on. And this is actually what we see with fascism very much, where it's a rationalization of the failures, of the contradictions of, advanced democratic capitalist societies, as we saw in the 20th century. So, it's not just that the authoritarian personality is irrational or insane, but it's that there's a very calculated form of prejudice that's operating that allows that person to just do very cruel, undemocratic things and still have a clean conscience. A little bit more about the authoritarian personality, and who was this person, as theorized by Adorno. This is someone who's very rigid. They tend to be inhibited, be prejudiced, and they tend to oversimplify things. Right, that if something feels right, it's right, and if there's someone who's talking too much and presenting something in a way that's too complicated, I don't got time, all that, that person is just lying. Or that person is just trying to confuse me. Or that person is too smart for, his or her own good. That there's a tend of prejudice in favor of simplification, oversimplification. And, it's okay to be simple, as we're talking to each other. That's actually helpful. But, some of these things are very complicated that we're talking about. When we talk about, the history of, political economy or of colonialism, things that asserted themselves in their most prominent form far in the past. The colonial activities of Great Britain or Germany, for that matter, or America, were once, more brazen and more unapologetic. But at a certain point, this was seen as being unsophisticated or unbecoming of a modern democracy, and so these things were disguised. Okay? And this is just the way things work when there's a lot on the line. Not saying it has to be that way, but typically that's how it has been. Which is to say that these are complex matters, and I think there's something very dangerous about trying to simplify them. The authoritarian personality tends to be ethnocentric, which means that they see their own ethnic group as superior to others. It's also like in-group centrism. Intellectuality or subtleness are regarded as being manipulative or even, kind of effeminate. Not something that a real straight shooter will do. They tend to be concerned with power, authority, obedience. These are super, super important things that really, get their goat, as is the case for many individuals in modern society. And so Adorno's F scale, which measured these things, saw that, it was a. Let me just back up a little bit. So Adorno used the fascism scale, the F scale, to assess these traits, and basically used a Likert style format, which is a 1 to 5, rubric for rating your answers. And you've probably all done these in your psych volunteer experiences. 1 is strongly disagree, 2 disagree, 3 agree, 4 disagree, or 4 is agree, 5 strongly agree. Right, so strongly disagree, agree equally, and disagree is 3, agree, strongly agree. I don't know why I'm finding this to be so confusing, but basically it goes 1 to 5. 1 is saying you disagree strongly, 5 is saying you agree strongly. Okay, and so essentially the higher score you get, the more prejudiced and more authoritarian Adorno says you are. One more detail about this personality is that they tend to be interested in the sexual goings-on of others. What other people are doing sexually, what other people are, up to sexually. Who does this person like? What do they like? All of these types of things. And, I think what's being theorized here about the curiosity and the sexual goings-on of others is that, humans just kind of are curious about sex. And, curiosity does gratify the self. But it's very, confusing to people when they're curious about things that maybe make them uncomfortable. Or, as in the case with many sexual things, they're curious about things that they maybe even believe are wrong. And so there sort of is this urge to put that on someone else. I just watched an interesting news story actually that was talking about the contemporary Christian music scene, and it was interesting. There was a female artist who was, a very popular contemporary Christian music artist, and she, talked about how if she would even just like raise her hands at a show, and maybe the smallest bit of her midriff would show that she, scores of, it was always the male fans. That's what she said, who would say that, you're being immodest. This is wrong. You're causing us to think of these things. And so, in a way, okay, and this is not to simplify, okay, what are the norms of, a very specific community that's bound together by a text. This is not to simplify these things, but what reminded me of kind of scapegoating and this feature of the authoritarian personality being interested in the sexual goings on of others is you can't just ignore it. You can't just say, okay, well, yep, had a sexual thought and okay, pray about it, deal with it, but actually it becomes so much about that other person, to the extent that that might be very shaming or damaging to that other person who is, in a way, putting so much of their life on hold to be this musical performer. And that's not the concern, though. The concern is not what's going to happen with that person, or to that person. The fact is that this person sort of gets blamed for someone else's urges and drives. That's just one way of looking at this. Here are some questions from the authoritarian personality scale, the F scale. Obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. And so we can think of that with that 1 to 5 scale, with 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree, 3 being in the middle. 2, people can be divided into 2 distinct classes, the weak and the strong. 3, if people would talk less and listen more, everyone would be better off. 4, what this country needs most, more than laws and political programs, is a few courageous, tireless, devoted leaders in whom the people can put their faith. 5, nobody ever really learns anything important except through suffering. So certainly not through, going to school or reading. That stuff isn't really important. 6, every person should have complete faith in some supernatural power whose decisions are obeyed without question. And 7, certain religious sects that refuse to salute the flag should be forced to conform to such patriotic action or be abolished. And so what Adorno is saying here is that the more people buy into these ideas, these ideas that, in a way, taken on their own, might just be a form of strategic Machiavellian patriotism, end up becoming the preconditions for something worse than anything anyone imagined. So fascism, should be considered as a forced unification. That, if you look at something like, the American, the United States, or if we look at, any other major world power, Western power, even thinking of Germany prior to World War II. These are very diverse societies that are bound together by rather weak bonds. Just, it's the fact that you just show up and see someone at work, but you can't really be real with them, or you have somebody at work that you like, but you have to compete with them, or, there aren't very meaningful things that people can do together, after work, or not anymore, or maybe at one point there was. That when we have a society that's very powerful, but not really bonded, then sort of these ideologies come through to say, oh, let's all be one, or, let's unify our vision. But, there's no unity. The unification has not happened. This is just sort of a tough talk from, a coach who doesn't really know the game. And so this is a nice way to consider the symbol of fascism, which is the fasces, which is a battle axe or a hatchet with a bundle of sticks. That's the fasces. wrapped around it, and it's a symbol for strength in numbers. You can break one stick with a certain level of force, but you can't just do that to a bundle. You need a much greater form of force. So, strength is sort of presented, sort of if you unify, you can be strong. But as our kind of theoretical investigation of fascism is revealing, unity by force unifies some aspects of people but leaves other aspects of people out, meaning that it's a way of bringing people together but maybe bringing the worst to the fore. What else? So, quote from Mussolini here, okay, who was, of course, fascist dictator of Italy, and they were, fascist before Germany was. But Mussolini said fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism, because it's a merger of state and corporate power. And this is kind of the inside story, inside scoop on fascism, that, it kind of comes with this very salt of the earth, common sense stuff about the people, but that is just the frosting. And, the real cake is a very dirty and very corrupt cooperation between vested corporate interests and state powers. And just to say that we're not being anti-state or anti-corporation here, okay? But laws exist to let's say separate the church from the state. Those exist for a reason. Or laws exist to have anti-monopoly statutes, practices for a reason. Laws exist about hiring practices, for a reason. We have elected officials also for a reason. Okay, corporations still have to follow laws for a reason. So, but we sort of get this werewolf, hybridized evil form of the state and the corporation and fascism. Something that certainly is accelerated by racial and social unrest, and also by deregulation of the corporate power. What is the fascist response to diversity? There is one, interestingly, right? Why was it that there was such affinity between, the fascist Japanese and the fascist Germans in World War II? There sort of is an interesting view of diversity in fascism, which just says that, it's not really just the problem with other groups even being around. It just is when other groups infiltrate a society and then won't do their own thing, but they kind of do this halfway deal. That they sort of want a form of diversity, but just in a different backyard. And certainly peace is not really guaranteed. For anyone who saw that show, The Man in the High Tower, which came out a few years ago on Netflix, they kind of show some of that about in a way, the chauvinistic respect between Japan and Germany, but also how, there were fault lines and violence seemed inevitable. So, but the fascist response to diversity sort of goes as such. It says, when everything's not cool in society and someone needs to be blamed, just create a scapegoat. This prevents us from having deep institutional and systemic reform. So just blame a certain minority group, or blame any ethnic group, blame a majority group, whatever. Vulnerable groups, non-dominant religions, easy targets. It's a way of sort of cutting a loss and saying, like, well, we don't really want to reform the way that we do our hiring practices, or we don't really want to actually have a better relationship with, let's say, marginalized communities. We don't really want to change anything, but we want to start, we want to be viewed positively. We want to be viewed as, someone who's like pro-human being or something like that. Or even, right, in the case of the Nazis, they claimed to be pro-white, but, utterly demolished the whole nation, ironically. Okay? So, when people don't want to keep all they have, this is something that's been observed about power, is that power will not surrender itself unless force is applied, or fear is applied, or duress is applied, and this could be political power, right? Just basically, power doesn't just vacate unless it is forced to, or strongly persuaded to, because it's a strong entity. So, when people don't really want to do real reform, they kind of will just choose some halfway reform and then try to paint it as being the full reform. That's essentially scapegoating. And so with this, we have the concept that fascism is authentic. There's something salt of the earth or non-pretentious about fascism. Adolf Hitler famously said that he was going to abolish fragmented interest groups and replace them with a party that was for everyone. And so, fascism in this way uses folksy, traditional, charismatic ideas that paint an impersonal entity in authentic colors. So what's wrong with scapegoating, right? It's a moral sin, we could say, but it's also toxic to society. Scapegoating serves to distract a cultural group from the real sources of social unrest: economic equality, problems in the family structure, child abuse, unemployment, personal suffering. The real problems are not being addressed. As Dr. Shuri Dukes says, here's a video. If you want to pause this video and watch what Dr. Dukes has to say, could be a good time to do it, or you can watch her video after. As she says, unless society actually gets better, the group of powerful insiders will always need to find a new scapegoat. Because, they find a new scapegoat, they destroy or marginalize the old scapegoat, but things don't get better because the real problem hasn't been addressed. And so then this is the very scary thing about scapegoating, is that, it sort of changes its target. Or there sort of is a sense of escalation of intolerance. And that's going to happen as long as the real causes are not addressed. Adorno says, what do we do about all this negativity if we don't want to just be scapegoating people, if we don't just want to be chauvinists? He said that critical thinking is essential. That critical thinking is going to reveal the suffering disguised by group identity. He also said art can do this. I saw a little clip from a famous blues artist who says, you experience a loss and you feel this way, and he does some amazing riff on his guitar that's very poignant, and then he says that's the blues. And you might get a feeling as you're listening to it, and it corresponds in an interesting way with what he's saying. That's the blues, what you feel. That's supposed to kind of orient you in the right way to reality and to other people, not to make too much of that, because critical thinking still needs to be part of the picture. Because Adorno was not just an emotionalist. He wanted thinking to happen and for distinctions to be made. But this would have the useful effect of, preparing people to practically respond to the real needs at hand. This is something that the, 19th century art critic and activist John Ruskin said, that if you were to truly give the working class art, then it would actually increase their political consciousness. And then so he said, well, people might be scared of that. But Adorno's saying that critical thinking, the revelation of suffering, and, the careful use of art can help orient people to what the real problems are. So what is critical thinking? This is clear and rational thinking that involves the critique of information. We can also think of critical thinking as a purification of knowledge and of how to think about knowledge and, what is knowledge, how to think about what constitutes knowledge and what might just constitute a rumor. You could check out what Wikipedia has to say about critical thinking and what it is to give you a little more context if you want. I have a link to that in the slides. Let's make a note now about another critical thinker, John Dewey. John Dewey was an American pragmatist, which is a philosophy that says whatever works is true. That might be concerning to some people. That might seem rather fascistic to people. And, I think it could be said that pragmatism has elements of fascism intrinsic to it. But, as it happens historically, pragmatism, set itself up as an opponent to fascism for the most part, saying that, sort of this shaming and obsession with sacrifice, obsession with an ancient truth, that are built into fascism, that are endemic to fascism, are, unpractical ways of thinking, and that if you could just give people a little bit more room to breathe, they might not buy into these awful ideologies quite so much. So, but John Dewey, problematic or as it may be, believed that whatever works is true. We have some different ways of looking at that, right? We already knew that William James said that the truth, it's not that the truth isn't a thing, it just is one way of organizing experience. But Dewey says that critical thinking helps us internalize knowledge and therefore makes decisions that better speak to our own interests. And now, what is the opposite of critical thinking? And certainly we have scapegoating, but we also have something like groupthink. This is a phenomena that is totally opposed to rational and critical thinking, and it just kind of is ushering people along to just read the room and go along with the room. That's the practice of making or decisions or thinking in a certain way, barely thinking in a way, that discourages creativity and that discourages individual responsibility. For an example of how groupthink can be used to explain aspects of the NASA Shuttle Challenger explosion, check out the following videos. These are videos that I'll, post in the module for this week. Okay, and we have 8 factors that contribute to groupthink. Let's think of this too. I'll read them off really quick, and you can go back and give it more attention on the slides. Illusion of invulnerability, collective rationalization, belief in inherent morality, stereotyped views of outgroups, direct pressure on dissenters, self-censorship, illusion of being anonymous. Mind guards are appointed, people who kind of come in to stop people from thinking ways that will disturb group complacency. Those are all factors that contribute to groupthink. But how do we counteract groupthink? Be aware of the consequences if and when the group is wrong. Seek out alternative viewpoints that disagree with your own and keep an open mind. Try to poke holes in your own argument. That's the use of critical thinking. Look at your ideas from the other side to better understand your own incentives. Adorno always said, always try to lose the argument if you're really interested in the truth. Be prepared to make mistakes. Practice expressing your views in front of a group. The leader should give high priority to airing objections. Talk your ideas through with a trusted outside source that will give you honest feedback. And last, sometimes, it's useful to divide the group into 2 separate deliberative bodies as feasibilities are evaluated, looking at how realistic options are, to kind of push back that intense group pressure a bit. And so that concludes our topic for today. I look forward to seeing what comes up in the discussion boards, and as always, please don't hesitate to email me or reach out if you would like to talk. Okay, thanks everyone, and take care.